Now, the conflict in Sudan has been making headlines across the world for the past few weeks, but many might not know what has caused the war. To help us unpack this, I'm now joined by Professor Lindy Heinecken from the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you so much, Prof, for joining us this evening. Now, of course, we know we have these two groups in Sudan. We have the military, and that's, of course, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He is the head of the armed forces. In effect, the country's president, if we'd like. And then we have his deputy, who is the leader of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. We have these two groups, and that, of course, being General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also better known, of course, as Hemeti. Let's talk about why these two groups are fighting in this country, and then we can also talk about that 2021 coup and how that also is impacting what's happening in the country right now.
Well, one has to understand the history of the country to start off with, and that the General Delgado of the Rapid Support Forces was supported by the previous president, al-Bashir, to actually sort of keep him in power in a certain way. He feared the present military because he knew the past history of the country and that he would be possibly also be ousted by a military coup. So you have a situation in this country where you have two armed groupings in a country. You've got the professional, shall we call it a professional armed forces, if we compare it to South Africa, our South African National Defence Force, and then you have a paramilitary group, which has now become, after the ousting of a civilian government, has now come into competition with each other for political and military power.
And let's talk about, the Rapid Support Forces. What are the Rapid Support Forces, and how is it that we have a country where there's the military, who you think is, of course, the main armed forces in the country, but then we also have the RSF. It is a bit confusing for someone who doesn't know, as you said, the history of that country.
So the Rapid Support Forces was created as a kind of a counter-force when under the, shall we call it, the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. And they, in fact, were the forces which also fought against South Sudan. And Hemeti, or General Dalgo, as we know him, of the Rapid Support Forces, was also the notorious leader of the Janjaweed, which led the genocide in the Darfur region. So there is a very long history there of human rights abuses, of genocide, of extreme violence and atrocity. So you had these two armed forces. The one that the then President al-Bashir did not trust, who then created the Rapid Support Forces, which he then used also to suppress opposition in South Sudan, which of course we all know got their independence in 2011. So this is what we're sitting in now. And now we're in a situation where these two military leaders are vying for political and economic power in the country.
And is that, the basis of what's happening in the country now? We have these two groups and both are just fighting for power. And the RSF, they're not agreeing, with what the military is saying, because the military, in essence, many would think that the RSF would then, after all of this, after 2013, would form part of the country's armed forces, but that hasn't happened. Why are they fighting? What can't they, get to in agreement?
Okay. Well, they are in a disagreement primarily about how to transition to a democracy, how to hand over democracy to civilian rule. As we know, there has been a framework for agreement for a democratic process. The Rapid Support Forces are not happy with the kind of arrangements that have been put in place. Basically, the arrangements require that they are integrated into the, shall we call it, the national armed forces. This will result in them actually losing power. And we must remember here that it's not just about political power and who is in control, but also control of the economy. Both of the different armed forces, both of these armed forces have got control of different segments of their economy.
The USA now, of course, they are warning that, they will be imposing sanctions. How will this impact that country if this is to happen?
Well, I mean, the sanctions has various effect. I mean, it has the impact on support for the population. It's got support for the political leaders, and the problem with sanctions in this specific case that it will affect the entire region. It will affect. I mean, if you impose sanctions on Sudan and the various and how goods are, there's already problems with the imports of goods at the port of Sudan, but it's going to impact on Chad, the Central African Republic, on South Sudan, on Ethiopia, Egypt. It's going to have an impact on the entire region. So how sanctions are going to be imposed, it's going to have a major impact.
It's so true. And just to touch on what you said there now, if we look at Sudan on a map, you have Egypt, Libya, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea. And then, of course, that port that you mentioned, the port of Sudan, they're just on the edge of the Red Sea. Very important to note that Sudan is in the middle of all of these countries. So those countries are definitely also going to be impacted by this conflict if it will be escalating to a war. I don't know if we can call it that yet, but it definitely will have an impact in all of those countries.
Absolutely, profoundly. And what we need to, I mean, I've actually just lectured to my students, my third year political sociology students on civil war, and I highlighted to them that these entire countries are caught in the Sahel belt, and all of these countries which are subject to the influence of Islamic fundamentalist movements, that all these countries are weak states. So, and we also know that whenever there is a civil war of this case, it just undermines development and undermines security. So the repercussions of this conflict for the entire region is absolutely profound and very concerning for the African continent.
And then we also see these ceasefires that have been, imposed, but it seems like both parties are not adhering to the ceasefires. We had one now for a 7-day ceasefire, and it seems there's been reports of fighting actually and airstrikes. This clearly is just absolutely terrifying for people living in that country.
Yeah, well, there's always a problem with ceasefire. So this specific ceasefire was negotiated with South Sudan. And which is great in a certain sense that it does allow humanitarian aid, and it does allow for civilians to actually move out through a specific corridor. But all ceasefires, unless there are specific conditions attached to this, it can actually exacerbate the conflict because it allows a time period where the actual respective armed forces cannot have, we are still seeing that it's not a total ceasefire, but it also allows them to regroup. So, when you have a ceasefire, this should be associated with specific conditions attached to each of the armed forces.
Just before we spoke to you, Prof, we also heard from a young lawyer, Maya Oman, and she said she doesn't see this conflict or war, as she called it, in the country stopping anytime soon. Sentiments you share?
Absolutely. When one looks at it, this is quite a unique situation when we're in terms of if this is a civil war, right? And here we have got really two significant military forces. It's not like a rebel forces, although I would say that the national armed forces are much stronger than the so in other words, the Sudanese armed forces are much stronger than the rapid support forces in terms of numbers. Here we're looking at about 120,000 compared to 75, maybe 170, better trained, for example. But we're definitely looking at a kind of an asymmetric warfare that is going to take place. And unless these forces can agree, like we had in South Africa during our transition towards a democracy, to integrate into a national armed forces, then we're not going to see peace. And I cannot see this happening very easily because of the vested influence and also the roles that are that the international role players are playing in this specific. We must not forget that the rapid support forces are also have been supported by the Wagner Group, so they are both Western and Russian alliances, and there is gold and natural resources, and it makes it a very messy mix in order to resolve this conflict.
Wish we had more time, especially to touch on that last bit that you mentioned, the Russian influence and, of course, the gold in that country, all these other factors that, of course, you know, is also part of this whole conflict. But thank you so much, Professor Lindy Heinecken from the University of Stellenbosch, joining me this evening just to talk about the conflict in Sudan. Of course, like we heard now, the RSF, the Prof doesn't see the integration of the RSF into the national military happening anytime soon. And, of course, that means the conflict in that country could escalate if peace isn't sorted out very soon.